Welcome to the EntrePastors podcast on YouTube. This is a show that helps pastors think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs. Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the EntrePastors podcast. My name is John Sanders. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. So grateful to have you joining us for another episode. Guys, we are so excited to introduce today's guest. In today's show, you're going to be hearing from a guy that has played a huge role in my life. I know Les would say the same thing. Dan Miller has been a voice for many years through his podcasts, through the books that he has written. He's been a voice that has had a huge impact on my life. Dan Miller is the host of the 48 Days to the Work You Love podcast. He's also written the book, 48 Days to the Work You Love, and he just leads an amazing community of people. If you had to summarize in a nutshell what Dan Miller does, he is a career coach. I mean, he helps people really discover what their passion and purpose in life is, and then helps them figure out a way to earn a great living doing the work that they were put here to do. And in his work, he has worked with many pastors, including this one, the one that's speaking to you right now. And as I've made some transitions in my life and in my ministry and in my career, Dan has been one of those faithful voices and friends speaking into my life and giving me guidance and direction. And so we are so honored to have him on our show today and speaking to you and introducing him to those of you that may not know him. And again, you're in for a real treat. I highly encourage you to check out his podcast, to check out some of the books that he has written. And I'm confident that he will have an impact on your life like he's had on mine as well. So without any further ado, let me get to this interview that Les and I did recently with our friend Dan Miller. Check this out. Well, Dan, welcome to the EntrePastors podcast, my friend. We are so delighted to have you on the show today.
Well, thanks. You know, I've been looking forward to this conversation with these two brilliant guys with a whole lot of history to share.
Yeah, well, I'll let Les say his words of honor here in just a minute, Dan, but let me start by just letting you know this podcast probably does not exist if it's not for Dan Miller, at least as far as my involvement in it. So like you're responsible on levels you probably don't even realize for what God has done in my life and where I am today. And I'm sure Les would say similar things. So go ahead, Les, read it like I wrote it.
Some folks can write them, some folks can do them. So I tell people that about my sermons. Paige, my wife Paige, is a really good speaker and a really good author. And people say sometimes that they think that she writes my sermons. And I say, some people can write them and some people can preach them. So I can say without any hesitation at all that what we're doing right now, from my perspective, absolutely would not happen without the influence of Dan Miller on my life. And that comes as a result of, for a couple of years, really for one complete year, being in a close association with another business coach and mentor of mine who specifically told me that I needed what Dan Miller could do in my life at the time that we were taking all of this all of the vision and making it happen in reality. And so as a result of the coaching mastery program and 48 days Eagles community specifically, I started to believe that this really could happen. So Dan, in a public way, I sure am grateful for you.
Oh, well, I thank you for that. I'm always thrilled when I see somebody come up with a new vision and then execute it. As you know, a lot of people have ideas, but it's taken massive action and executing, which you guys have certainly done. So I'm thrilled to watch what's coming together.
Well, thanks, man. Well, hey, for those that are listening to this that may not know who you are, do you mind just giving us a little bit of a highlight of the work that you do? And then I want to get into your background a little bit too and unpack, you growing up, even in a pastor's home, because you've seen ministry from that angle. And so just tell us a little bit about the work you do there with 48 Days and then we'll go from there.
Okay, sure. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, the top of my head to the tip of my toes. I've never had a real job, so I've always just seen ideas to execute on those. But this thing that I'm doing now grew out of a Sunday school class, which I never anticipated being part of what I was doing to generate income or part of my business. It was strictly ministry and service, teaching a Sunday school class. but the needs were so immense and that class grew just so exponentially. We moved it from a Sunday school class to a Monday night, did that for 8 years, and people came from other states, other churches, and it was obvious there was a real need there. And the unique need that I didn't anticipate was not the 18-year-old who came to that career life transitions class, 18-year-old who was trying to decide what to major in college, or the 22-year-old who is out and just lost their job at Burger King, wondering how to get on at Taco Bell. I had a few of those, but the primary attendees for that class that grew so big were physicians, dentists, attorneys, pastors, engineers, accountants, people with professional degrees in their mid-40s who are saying, I'm not sure this is it. I'm doing okay, but I don't think this really captures the best of what God has given me. So I was moving into that sweet spot where I've had the privilege of working many years now and helping people kind of take a fresh look at that stage of life. What is this all about? What should I be doing to honor how God has gifted me? Not just ways that I can provide for my family, but ways that really take the essence of my unique gifts, my passion, my talent, and bring that together. So 48 Days to the Work You Love is probably the best known moniker to attach to my name. That book has been out now for 20 years. I update it every 5 years, but that's still the core message. Figure out how you're uniquely gifted and what should that look like on Monday morning that gives you a sense of fulfillment and joy and peace in what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, you've transformed many lives through that message and through the work that you do there with your book and the podcast and the live events, the speaking, all of the ministry really that has flowed out of that message. But take us further back in your background, growing up, share, because you speak about this often on your own podcast. For those that have never heard that story, take us back to where Dan Miller started and your upbringing and, again, growing up in a pastor's home. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Well, our theology was a big force in our home. My grandparents were Amish, so horse and buggy, no electricity, no running water. And then my parents became conservative Mennonite, which is kind of not an uncommon move, but conservative Mennonite, meaning we did have cars. They were always black. We didn't have running water inside the house till I was in about the 8th grade. So we slowly adapted those things that would be seen in that environment as being more liberal. Each of those moves was excruciatingly painful for my dad in making a decision about how to go in that direction. So it was very much not just a Sunday morning, practice for us. No, it was our entire lives were immersed in that culture and the theology that permeated our lives so broadly. When my dad was 37 years old, I was a little kid. We were living in New York. He was a sharecropper. And so just providing for his family by farming. And the church heard about this church. The church was Alden Mennonite Church in Alden, New York. They heard about this church in Ohio that was fairly new, had about 30, 40 members, and they needed a pastor. The church selected 4 young men in their church, 4 young men, upstanding young men, but no discussion about calling, giftedness, training, desire, passion, anything. 4 young men, and using the biblical model, they put 4 straws in the Bible. Each young man drew a straw, and you can see where this is going. Guess who got the short straw?
Mm-hmm.
It was seen as that. So it was not the traditional method of calling that we anticipate, but that's how my dad became a pastor. He accepted that responsibility as a responsibility, and he learned as he could. He had a 6th grade education, but he studied voraciously, read, went to conferences, found mentors to grow into that position as a pastor. I grew up in that environment. So my dad was a pastor. The expectation in terms of what I would do vocationally was to help him on the farm. That was not only an expectation, it was a very explicit obligation for him to provide for me until I was 16 years old or whatever, then quit school, help him on the farm. I wanted more than that. I hesitate to use the word more because that can be a full, rich life, but I wanted things that were other than what I was observing there. I wanted to go more and have more, do more. And so I elected to continue with my education, much to my parents' dismay, and went on to college, went on to one of those heathen universities called the Ohio State University. And so I did that not with a career plan, but simply as a kind of a socially acceptable way to escape the farm. That's all that it was, a way to get out of the farm. But in doing so, I did see some other opportunities and found this space ultimately to use intellectual property, writing, speaking, coaching, as a way to use the gifts that I think God has given me. Very, very different than my dad. My dad never really understood my economic model. Now, he understood milking cows, you sell the milk. You grow soybeans, you take them to town. But to get paid for thinking, for talking, for just talking with people, he never really understood that. Now, in his later years, again, parting from that lifestyle, that culture, that theology was a painful transition for everybody involved. Time is a wonderful healer. And over time, my dad was thrilled with what I was doing. And he had my books in the nursing home with him to give away to friends or point me out on TV, those kind of things. And I'm really thrilled that it ended up in that way. But it was a very, very different path for me than what I grew up with and what was there generationally before me.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing, and then Les, I'll turn it over to you for a few questions. But Dan, I want to use your background as kind of a metaphor. Follow this. I'm thinking as you're sharing that story, on some levels, you just described where so many pastors find themselves. Again, the details are different, but many pastors find themselves almost stuck in this life that may be a little less than joyless. They maybe feel a sense of obligation for how they got there, or, they were told that to serve God fully with their life, it has to look a certain way. And so they went to Bible college and seminary, and they kind of knew the thing. And I know I'm painting a really bleak picture. Not every pastor hates their job.
Sure.
I'm not saying that, but they end up there out of a sense of obligation. They feel kind of stuck. And yet, maybe there's these crazy ideas out there of it's possible to have more and to do more. I know you've worked with pastors, many pastors over the years that have come to you in that place of feeling stuck and frustrated. And I was just going to ask you from your experience to speak to that, as you think back over the years, the many pastors and other professionals that have come to you kind of feeling stuck in their career, like they're wanting something more. What are, describe that pastor, if you will. What are some of the common traits that you see, or what are some of the things you notice about that, specifically a pastor that feels just stuck in the line of work that they felt so called to do?
Oh my, wow. Yeah. Powerful, powerful question. And in identifying those professional groups that I did a minute ago, in terms of the numbers of people that I've worked with, number one were dentists. There's a lot of very frustrated dentists out there, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Number two is pastors. And while I've worked with physicians, attorneys, and lots of other, pastors is number two in terms of just quantity of people. And here's what often happens. People who feel a call to ministry in that way. And so the obvious application of a unique calling from God is to be a pastor. I mean, you guys know that. So you go to Bible school, seminary, whatever, you get in as a pastor, and all of a sudden these guys realize, man, this is not what I signed up for. People expect me to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm being called on to deal with teenagers that don't come home at 2:00. I'm having to deal with, drug issues in families. And all of a sudden now we're doing a building project. I'm expected to be the general contractor. I mean, all of a sudden there's all these diverse things. And I've often, in working with pastors we're trying to get a handle on this, I have them list the things that they are doing. And oftentimes that list is, 30, 40 different things that seemingly are even unrelated that they're expected to handle. And it's unrealistic. And it's challenging in that a lot of times people are confronted with that most at the beginning stages of growing a church. You have a church of 60 people, that's one thing. It changes a little bit at 180 people, but all of a sudden it's 600 people, and all those things really are amplified. And it's still, the burden is on the pastor, where they may not at that point be large enough to have a full staff to start delegating all those things. And that's where these guys oftentimes get really, really stuck. Now, another thing, and I'll just throw this in, again, where there's so many issues here. Another thing that I've seen, frankly, are those pastors who then are pastors of larger churches, where they're getting a very healthy salary. And although they're absolutely burned out, dread Sunday mornings, they feel trapped. How am I going to pay for groceries next week if I don't do this? What am I equipped to do? If I stop this, I don't have marketable skills to go something else. At least that's the impression they have. And so they feel trapped. I mean, my heart breaks for these guys that I've seen over the years again and again and again, who just are saying, I'm not sure this is it. I thought this was a clear, pure kind of vocational choice, a unique choice. And then too, that comes into it as well. It's not like an attorney who can decide to go, drive a potato chip truck. It's very different with a pastor, because when a pastor leaves what he's doing to do something else in terms of a career, the outside view is he walked away from his calling. That's a lot different than a doctor saying, I don't want to do this, or a dentist saying, I don't want to do this, and we redirect them. That's okay. But a pastor has to deal with all that psychological dynamic as well. How am I going to explain this? I don't want to do this anymore. Yeah, that's tough issues. But all of those, we can create unique, wonderful, wonderful opportunities for redirection and maintaining the heart for ministry.
Yeah. Wow. So much of what you said is on point, Dan. So we have some people right now that have listened to what you've said and are thinking, this guy is reading my mail. Where is the phone bugged? Because you have hit you just pushed several buttons now that has their attention. So if we could just dig down a little bit deeper and peel back a couple of layers of that onion. You mentioned that the mindset or the belief is that the pastor, because he's so focused on what it means to be leader of that particular fellowship, that he doesn't think that he's got any marketable skills. I want you to talk about that and lean into that a little bit more, but because all three of us know that that is absolutely not true. That, pastoring, shepherding is not a skill in itself. That's a manifestation of several giftings and several skills that a person is either born with because of their, and as a nature to, or personality traits, or God has gifted them in some way. And God's Spirit is a catalyst for those gifts. So we've got somebody now that's listening, and you've got their attention, and they're telling themselves, man, I wouldn't even know where to start. I wouldn't know what is my passion outside of the context of being an employee of the church. I know that you've got a framework or a way that you lead into that conversation, and I may be messing it up, but it's something like that our passion isn't discovered as much as it is developed. So would you just talk about the framework that you use to walk people through that? And then if you could give us a couple of examples of people that came to you and didn't think that they had a marketable skill, but then after talking it through a little bit, understood that God had gifted them in many ways.
Yeah. How much time we have for stories. I mean, I love the opportunity that I've had to walk with people through this process where they were feeling discouraged. A lot of times, when somebody's feeling discouraged, they start to compromise other areas of their life. They eat too much, they're too sluggish. They start to make other little, perhaps even integrity compromises, and really sad kind of deterioration that happens when things spiral down together, and they can also spiral up together. But the framework that I like to start with is distinguishing between vocation, career, and job. So vocation is the big picture, and we would include in that your calling, your purpose, your mission. But that's the big picture. So if we use as an example, somebody really wants to help reduce pain and suffering in the world. Let's just use that as an example. That could be a legitimate vocation or calling. Then we look at what kind of careers would fulfill that. All right, help reduce pain and suffering in the world. Okay, I could be a physician. I could be a sports massage therapist. Yeah, I could be a biologist. I could really be a teacher, a politician. I could be a pastor to address that big picture calling, help reduce pain and suffering in the world. But if we frame it as such, we immediately get the sense that there's not one career application for anything you can identify as a calling. There are many. So then we have, that is a subset. The career is a subset where pastor would be legitimate. And then we go to job, just the daily job, again, if we frame it as such, and you can see how losing a job should not change your vocation or calling. That's the quandary that a lot of pastors get stuck in. They think if I leave the job that I have, I'm walking away from my mission and calling. No. Here's an example. And there's right above me here in my office, there's a beautiful artwork that was done, a painting. It's got a musical theme, was done by a young man who came to me as a pastor. His church actually sent him in to see me. And in talking with him, I mean, for 10 minutes, I'm like, man, who sold you this bill of goods? And he was really taken back. He's like, what do you mean? You know, isn't it the most godly thing that I could possibly do? And I said, no, you're an imposter. You're living out somebody else's dream. You're trying to do the right thing, but this doesn't fit you. I said, what is it that when you're doing it, you feel like you really come alive? We talk about athletes being in that zone, you know, when everything just comes together to let you know, wow, this is what I was born for. And he described immediately, he would go into a room in their little rented house, lock the door, put on Beethoven or Mozart, and he would paint. He would paint. That was his kind of cathartic release to restore himself. I had him quit everything he was doing. He was actually working a job as a night desk clerk at a Holiday Inn during the week just to try to eke out enough money to keep the lights on in his house with 5 small children. I said, man, quit everything you're doing. For 4 years, he did faux finishes where we'd use brushes, sponges, rags to create these dramatic effects on people's walls. But in that period, and he was paid very well for doing that, but in that period of time, he also developed the artwork that he was drawn to, these beautiful pieces of art, and was able to position. I connected with an agent, was able to position where he started making, I mean, literally 10 times the money he had been making previously. Now, did he walk away from his calling, his ministry? Talking to him now, he will say, as a pastor, people knew what to expect of me. They knew what I was going to say, what I was expected to say. He says, now I don't have that moniker. He says, now I'm the artist. So I'm in people's beautiful homes. He said, they share easily with me their vulnerabilities, their fears, their challenges. He said, I have way more opportunity to minister today than I did as a pastor. Now, I'm not an artist, and that's certainly not the path that most people are going to take, but that's the process of figuring out what is unique about you. What is that real heart for ministry that you have? Because believe me, we can find other ways to put legs on that if the idea of being in a pulpit on Sunday morning is not a fit, if it's draining for you, if you somehow are ready for a new season. So it's not a matter of walking away from your ministry or calling. It's a matter of let's find a new daily career application that allows you to continue in ministry, but may look very different to people on the outside.
Go ahead, Les.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Dan, one of the things I have loved about listening to your podcast over the years is that your voice has given me permission to pivot multiple times. Because I think, like you alluded to this earlier, pastors don't feel that they have that permission. We, you know, in other lines of work, it seems like when someone transitions out of one thing and tries something new, we celebrate it. You know, good for you. You're following your dreams. You're doing what you love. Like, we wish them well. But when a pastor says, I'm not going to be a pastor anymore, I'm going to leave this church job to go do something else, we almost look at it with this sense of disappointment. Like, oh, that's too bad. You know, are you and God not on good terms anymore? You know, and so your voice has given me that permission, or been one of several really powerful voices that have given me permission to know that it is okay to pivot. Like, whoever said that when we get into this one thing, like that, we're locked into that for the rest of our life. So speak more to that pastor right now that feels locked in. They feel like, man, this is what I'm doing. I love that not only do you give the permission, but you also give all kinds of creative outlets. Like, you can hear somebody say, okay, this is what I feel called to. And then I'll just hear you on your podcast rattle off 20 different ways that they could utilize that, you know, passion and fulfill that in various different ways. So just help these pastors that are listening to this know that they can still serve God and do a whole bunch of other things, and it's all ministry. So I'll let you run with that.
Oh my, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to come back and tell another story. My goodness. I've got a pastor that I just worked with recently, and we created an exit plan. Nobody in his church knows it yet. They will, because we've got a clear plan created. He was ready to transition into something else. He's not totally burned out, but he's ready for something else. And so we decided and he wants to move a couple states away to be closer to his daughters. So they've got this mapped out. Well, rather than going there and just trying to find another position as a pastor, he really wanted something where he wouldn't have the day-to-day responsibilities like that. He's gotten his real estate license. He's going to be in real estate. He is so excited about it. I mean, he's just thrilled about what's coming, because in the studying that he's doing, he's gotten more and more excited. Now think about that. When you're going to meet with a couple, let's say it's a young married couple, they're going to make the biggest financial decision they've ever made in their life. Is that an opportunity for really leaning in to know their hearts, to know their passions, to know their vision for the future, their calling, their sense of mission, purpose? You better believe it. Who could better do that than somebody that has had experience as a pastor to actually do that? I had a gentleman who I worked with last year as well, who, now this is pretty graphic, but his wife commented, they were sitting on the couch watching a movie together one night. She commented about this stench that she couldn't identify. Long story short, they located the stench was coming from him. Now, this is a psychological phenomenon that is not that uncommon. He was so depressed, so discouraged, so pent up with things that he was holding inside himself. His body was releasing a stench.
Wow.
When we started to get clear on options for this poor gentleman, his health improved immediately. Those things went away. We developed a plan because, as you alluded to, so often they don't see what the other options are. You know, in many ways, it's easier to work with an 18-year-old who hasn't had a lot of experience because everything's a possibility. When somebody's had one thing that they've done for many years, they tend to be very, very narrow in their vision of what's possible. And when I start talking about, you could have a hot dog stand, you know, down on the street, and you're just to get them thinking in a broader sense, you know, they are blown away. But when we start looking at those things that are possibilities, we always come back to the individual, though. We want what is unique to you. As I mentioned, a guy who paints, that's not going to be common for a lot of pastors, but for him, that was a very natural application of skills that he had. Now, in looking at the things that most pastors do, they do have to write their sermons unless they have a page next to them to write their sermons for them, and all they have to do is deliver them. But they, you know, they write sermons. You know, think about the things they do. They counsel with people. So we have a lot of people, pastors, who are great prospects for coaching. And they're like, my goodness, I've been doing this for 20 years, but I didn't know what to call it. They can't call it counseling because that brings in some kind of legal ramifications. But coaching is often a very legitimate thing that they can do, where they can be selective in who they work with, and they don't have this open-ended 24/7. They can work 2 days a week. It's often a very soft transition to go into that. I have a pastor that I worked with who, in looking at all those things that he did, well, I got two quick examples. So one guy had for 19 years been a pastor. He had never experienced as an adult getting up and not putting on a suit and tie. He would go to work. Well, the church let him go. There's no real misconduct, but there were some things that were kind of undermining everybody's happiness, and they let him go. He was devastated. When he came in to see me, I had to keep asking him to speak up because his voice was so low, because his discouragement was showing through in that way. And in listing all the things that he was doing, the thing he enjoyed most was being in the pulpit on Sunday morning, exhortation, teaching, breaking down the word, you know, leading people, persuading. That's what he enjoyed most. But 95% of his time, he was doing other things. And I said, I think you would be excellent in doing this. But I said, I don't think you're ready to move into that right now. You need a period of just personal healing to restore your confidence, your physical health and vibrancy and all that. He says, well, I've got a physician in my congregation, previous congregation, who I'm friends with, and he has a lot of property. And I said, talk to him. The guy says, well, if you're really serious, you know, I've got fields that need to be bush hogged and fence rows that need to be cleaned. I said, go do that for 2 weeks. Just go do that. He did that for 4 months. It was so cleansing to get out there in a tractor with his shirt off and sweat and be out there in nature. It was such a healing position for him. He came back. He is now one of the sales reps for one of the biggest Christian publication producers to produce content. So he does seminars in churches like Jack Hayford's church, done not that long ago, for local pastors to introduce them to new products that this publisher is coming out with. I mean, he flies around the country. It's a perfect fit where we just identified that one thing that he was really good at. And now he's in a position to do just that. He's feeling healthier than he ever has. He's not a pastor, but he's still in the work of the ministry. And there's so many opportunities like that. Another pastor I worked with who, 59 years old, Southern Baptist pastor, highly respected in what he was doing, great work history, but he was ready for a new season. Just didn't want the ongoing level of responsibility that he had. And again, identifying what he was doing, I said, you probably have 3 or 4 sermons that are kind of your core messages. Could you develop those into content that would be applicable for like in corporations? You know, if it's motivating people, if it's clarifying your vision, there are a lot of things that people produce as sermons that would be produced in ways that could be applicable for conferences like that. He said, yeah, but now what happened, he got bogged down in the creation of those. And I said, this doesn't need to be that complicated. I said, I want you to contact some of the major producers of programs that are offered to companies out here. So Paget Thompson, Fred Pryor, those kind of companies, you know, they'll market how to deal with difficult employees or some kind of topic like that. They'll market, they'll fill a hotel room with 120 people and they need somebody to walk in and just present the content. He did that. He got offered a position with Fred Pryor immediately, 10 days a month. Now that's more than what they usually do, but they saw this guy as such a great candidate, 59 years old, pastor experience. He contracted with them 10 days a month. They fill the room. He doesn't have to do the marketing. They fill the room. He walks in, delivers the content. Makes $2,000 a day for doing that. 10 days a month. That's more money he's ever made in his life. And he feels like he's on vacation.
Yep.
I mean, no evenings, no weekends. He and his wife can really relax and be together, worship as they want to, where they want. I mean, there's so many opportunities like that where people can move ahead with their heart's desire, but be relieved of the often unrealistic expectations that have been placed on them as a pastor.
Yeah, it's so good.
Wow.
So good.
Hey, John, if I could ask one thing here. First of all, I'm still stuck back on the hot dog stand. I mean, you had me at hot dog stand, and John, if I had a hot dog stand, I'd be big as a house. I know what would not work for me. Okay, so now you flipped a switch here, Dan, and maybe somebody has gone from believing that there is no marketable skill that they have because they've been, serving in the context of that one role for 20 years. And now all of a sudden they've got 50 things going through their head and they're trying to think, how do I narrow that down? And I believe that you have an exercise kind of as a call to action here to make this real practical. You've got an exercise that you often share with the people about how to go from that huge elephant down to about one bite that they can actually implement. Would you mind just sharing that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. And it's not a complicated process. There are 3 elements to it. The first thing is to identify what are your unique skills and abilities, and not just the things that you've been expected to do, but the things that you really enjoy doing. By the time anybody has a little life experience, be that at 27 or 57, those ought to become pretty obvious. Skills and abilities. Number 2, personality traits. We use the DISC profile. Some people use, you can use the Enneagram, Strength Finders. There's a whole lot of things out there, but you ought to have something that helps you really identify how do you relate best to other people? What environments are you most comfortable in? Are you very outgoing and gregarious? Are you more introverted? We have pastors who are at any place on that spectrum. They aren't all one thing, but know that about yourself. So skills and abilities, personality traits, and then what I call values, dreams, and passions. What are those recurring things that keep coming up where you realize, wow, it's when I'm around the elderly that I really feel like I have the most to offer, or it's when I'm working on ideas and concepts. It's not even when I'm around people. Again, no right or wrong, but as you identify those three things, skills and abilities, personality traits, values, dreams, and passions, you ought to be able to get a clear picture of what are those things that identify who you are. 85% of the process of having the confidence of proper direction comes from looking inward first. And as believers, we ought to understand that. Wow, it's not just looking out there, who's hiring, where are the opportunities, the job trends. No, let's look at how God has uniquely and wonderfully created me. And as you do that, it's not being selfish, it's not being egotistical, it's being ready to be the best steward imaginable of how God has uniquely gifted you. And a lot of people try to bypass that, thinking I'm just going to do what's right, what's godly, what other people expect of me. And they subdue those very things that God put in them as unique opportunities to be salt and light. So that's the process, going through that.
Is one of the things I love about your message, Dan, is you're not just about go to work and get a paycheck and earn an income. It's really tapping into that skill set, that passion that God has put inside of each and every one of us. We're uniquely wired and shaped. And I love that you call that out in people, you know, to do work that they truly do find meaningful and fulfilling and purposeful. So I have one more big question. I can't promise it'll be my last one, but here's my last big question I'm going to throw at you, Dan. We've talked a little bit in this conversation, well, really talked a lot about pastors that maybe are in that place where they want to transition out of traditional ministry and do something else, which is good and valid. Like I think more pastors need to know that that is a good option for them, and it does exist, and they're not letting God down if they choose that path. But I'm going to ask you to speak to that pastor who still wants to be a pastor and still enjoys the work of pastoring, but maybe wants to do something else as well. And instead of just going and trading their, hours for dollars, working at the local Dollar General or Walmart or something like that, they actually can do work. Maybe it's create their own business or find something that really flows out of that gifting that God gave them. So it's really, I'm asking you to speak to the pastor that wants to do both, and that still desires to be in ministry, but also wants to be an entrepreneur or show up in some capacity. What really made me key in on this, Dan, was when you were describing that pastor a minute ago, that, for 4 weeks was out, or 4 months rather, was out in the field working with his hands, sweating under the sun, like how life-giving that was. At least in my circle of growing up in the church, there was this message to pastors that, man, it's this one thing you do, and it's ministry becomes this all-consuming singular identity. Speak to the pastor that says, can I have two things that I'm passionate about? Is it healthy if I have something outside of the church that I find, a passion in and can also make an income doing? So speak to that bivocational, or however you want to say, that pastor that, let's call him an entree pastor. How about that? Speak to the entree pastors out there.
There's a good term. We'll use that, entree pastor. Well, again, you'll recall that I said I grew up with a dad who was a Mennonite pastor. Now, you know the model for Mennonites, it's very much tent making. You're not paid for that. When I was growing up with my dad as the pastor, and primary responsibility, of course, for the church, there wasn't church staff, it was my dad. The church would take up a love offering for our family once a quarter, 4 times a year. And I remember very clearly as a little kid, sometimes that offering would get as high as $40 or $50. That was my dad's pay. So it was clear that he wasn't dependent on that. And of course, the theological perspective behind that is, instead of being dependent on the people you're preaching to, I mean, Paul addressed that. You need to tickle the ears of the people that you're speaking to if they're buying your groceries and paying your mortgage. So that's a topic for another day, perhaps, because that goes pretty deep. So I grew up, but in that kind of a model where my dad farmed to support his call to being a pastor. So farming was secondary, but that's where the income was made. So there wasn't any challenge in having to preach what the people wanted to hear because they weren't paying him. So there's that. But I also love seeing somebody who says, here I am in a little town. I mean, we mutually know a gentleman who is described like that, lives in a small town, decided he wanted to over the abandoned church across the street. And so now they've got a nice little congregation. Over 50% of the people walk to church. Well, again, the image of that, that's not going to create an income that's sufficient to raise 5 children in that case. He has an educational program, a program that he's developed for educators. So it's sold into schools and universities, and he's done this for years. It creates well over 6-figure income for him. That's where the income comes from. So there's a freedom to pastor without thinking, how can I squeeze another $500 a month out of this little congregation to meet my needs? I love that model. I think that brings a lot of freedom to the idea of being a pastor. Instead of having it so narrowly focused, that's the only thing that's producing income. Now, one of the really big distinctions that we look for in this is, can we help this pastor create residual income? So we're used to linear income, where you do something once and you get paid once. And frankly, that's the model most pastors experience. You preach this month, we give you a check. You preach next month, we give you another check. You don't preach, your income stops. But is there something we could create, like this gentleman has an educational program? A lot of pastors are sitting right on top of what we would call their own acres of diamonds and don't recognize it. Is there something in a key series of sermons that you present that we could put together as a course? And you put that out there at $97, not a whole lot of money, but all of a sudden you have something that's not geographically specific. If it's a course on raising healthy teenagers, they don't have to live in your town to purchase that. With the technology we have today, they could be anywhere in the world. What if in the course of a year, you had that course that sold for $97, but you had 1,000 people? Again, not a big number, but 1,000 people. Well, all of a sudden that's $100,000. And that could really transform the pressure somebody may feel to then be able to choose to pastor a small church. The gentleman I was referring to a minute ago, who you guys know, he dedicates 10 hours a week to pastoring that little church. That's a healthy kind of balance. He's not going to get absorbed into just spending 60 hours a week there. No, he dedicates 10 hours a week. That's another thing that a lot of pastors may have difficulty doing, drawing boundaries, thinking that they're available all the time, when realistically they ought to be saying, how can I provide 40 hours of good service to this opportunity? Yeah. I love that. And I think you guys are really onto something here, where you talk about EntrePastors, where, somebody may want to continue pastoring, but wow, what if they wrote a book? What if they got a book out there? There are no obstacles to that. What if not everybody's going to write the next purpose-driven life, but we know that created a whole lot of income for Pastor Rick Warren. Joel Osteen with his books. There's certainly others, but you can have a book that sells 60,000 copies, and it could be a way to extend your message, your impact, your influence, and also create a significant amount of income. So courses, books, seminars, one-day events, all those things are possibilities that are often very closely aligned with what a pastor is already doing.
Really good. Really good. And so what I hear you saying, and what I know that you believe, is that this is not an either or. This is a lifestyle and a decision that a pastor can make, where you're almost, in some cases, they may be digging a well right now that'll be drank from by them and those that depend on them much, much later. So in some ways you could, if someone wanted to pivot a bit in their focus in pastoral ministry, they could begin building up, for lack of a better word, let's call it a platform. They could begin building a platform or the foundations of a business now, to where at some point when it's time to step away, and it's a time that they and the Lord know, then they can step away on their terms as God leads them, and not feel stuck out of a sense of having to pay the bills of doing something maybe that it may be time for them to do something else.
That's right. And the tendency to maybe stay too long.
There you go.
When their heart's desire has diminished, and yet they feel like, well, this is what I know to do. I need to stay here. What I like to do with pastors is say, okay, how could we let's look at opportunities to create ongoing residual income that duplicates your current salary. Well, then all of a sudden, you don't have a whole lot of pressure there for a transition, if in fact that time comes. Now, one of the dicey things here is that needs to be clarified, and it needs to be clarified as an opportunity at the time of taking that position. There've been a lot of sticky situations I've been involved in where a pastor has written a book as an example. What if the book does really well? If there's not a clear understanding, the church may say, you did that on our time. We were paying you. We should get the money that's coming in from the book. That needs to be clarified. It's not an easy right or wrong, good or bad thing, but it just needs to be clear so there are no hard feelings along the way.
Well, and you know something, that is one of the subjects that, Lord willing, we'll be able to talk to you at another time about, because there are 2 or 3 things here that could be completely different episodes and for other podcasts. So we, again, Dan, want to thank you from the bottom of our heart for giving your time to us and for our listeners. They're certainly worthy of all of this counsel. So I'm gonna, if John could wrap it up here in a moment by sharing a couple of things that we have going on. Before he does that, would you let people know how they can reach out? You've got so many resources out there and means to help them get started, really wherever they are in their journey. So would you share some resources that they could find or ways that they could reach out to you or what you've produced?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to just have this conversation. I love this. And this is not content that I'm asked to address commonly. As you know, this is kind of outside. So I love the opportunity to come on and unpack this. It's something I really have a heart for, having grown up as the son of a pastor and feeling at a young age myself that, wow, if I really submitted myself to God, he's going to make me be a pastor too. And I'm not sure I want to do that. But yet growing into the understanding that we can do effective ministry in a variety of ways. I mean, I love the journey that I've been able to kind of live out. But yes, 48days.com is our site. There's a lot of content there. There's a coaching tab. And if people go to the coaching tab, they can see the ways that I work with people. There's a process I've used with lots of pastors called the intentional life process. And it's exactly that, where we go through creating a really clear life plan for the next season in your life, regardless of what the past has brought. Yep. 48days.com and get you started.
All right.
Well, hey, thanks for watching this episode of the EntrePastors podcast. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can be notified every time we release a new episode. If you'd like to get connected to other pastors who are learning to think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs, then we invite you to check us out on Facebook. Just search for the EntrePastors Connect group, answer a few of our simple questions there, and we'd love to include you in the conversations. And if you're really ready to go to the next level, then we invite you to join our EntrePastors membership community. When you become a monthly subscriber, you will receive access to courses, exclusive community, and coaching that will help you along in your own EntrePastors journey. If there's anything else we can do to serve you, please visit us at EntrePastors.com, and we will do our best to serve you there. God bless everybody. See you soon.